The rifle scope trembled against Master Chief Petty Officer Casimir Falcon Volkov's weathered cheek as he watched the impossible unfold 300 meters below. His SEAL sniper team had been positioned on this Afghan ridgeline for 6 hours, tasked with eliminating a high-value target who had been coordinating Taliban operations from a fortified compound. 3 shots, 3 misses. The wind had been perfect, the calculations precise, yet somehow every 7.62 round had sailed wide of the mark. The old man emerged from the shadows like a ghost materializing from the mountain itself. Dressed in traditional Afghan robes, his beard silver against sun-darkened skin, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades reading the language of stone and sky. The SEAL team watched through their scopes as he approached their concealed position, his hands empty but his eyes holding secrets that made hardened warriors pause. "Sir, we have an unknown approaching from the northeast," whispered Petty Officer First Class Reina Viper Castellanos into her radio, her finger hovering near the trigger of her secondary weapon. She had earned her call sign during her third deployment when she'd eliminated 6 insurgents in a single engagement, moving through a bombed-out schoolhouse like a serpent through tall grass. Her reputation preceded her in every briefing room from Coronado to Kabul. The old man stopped exactly 10 feet from their position and spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Your shots are missing because you're fighting the mountain instead of listening to it." His voice carried the weight of authority that came not from rank but from something deeper, more primal. The wind speaks differently at this altitude when the sun touches the eastern peaks. Falcon exchanged glances with his team. They were Navy SEALs, the most elite warriors on the planet, graduates of the most punishing military training ever devised. This stranger, whoever he was, had just walked up to their classified position and diagnosed their tactical failure with the casual confidence of a professor correcting students. "Who are you?" Falcon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Someone who has been watching mountains kill good men for 40 years. He gestured toward the rifle. "May I?" Every instinct screamed against it, but something in the stranger's demeanor commanded respect. Falcon had learned to trust intuition over protocol in places where hesitation meant death. The mission was failing, his team's reputation hung in the balance, and conventional wisdom had already proven inadequate. "The target moves to the western balcony in 12 minutes, the old man continued, as if reading classified intelligence from the air itself. "He follows the same pattern every day, but the wind patterns shift with the temperature differential between the valley and peaks." Falcon's radio crackled with increasing urgency from command, demanding status updates on the elimination. Time was running out, and failure was not an option. The sniper's nest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through granite crevices. 3 of America's deadliest warriors found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about precision and patience. The old man waited, his outstretched hand steady as carved stone, offering to demonstrate truths that textbooks had never taught them. Falcon made a decision that would haunt military briefing rooms for years to come. He handed over his rifle to a complete stranger, trusting instincts honed by a dozen deployments and countless nights when split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Barrett M82 looked different in the old man's hands, somehow more natural, as if the weapon had been waiting its entire mechanical existence for someone who truly understood its purpose. His fingers traced the barrel with the reverence of a musician touching a priceless violin, feeling vibrations that spoke of ballistic potential and environmental harmony. "This rifle has killed 23 men," he said quietly, not as boast but as simple observation. Each shot was necessary. Each death served a purpose larger than the individual pulling the trigger. His eyes never left the compound below, tracking movement patterns invisible to less experienced observers. Viper adjusted her position, studying the stranger through her secondary scope. Something about his stance triggered recognition deep in her tactical memory, a familiarity that shouldn't exist but felt undeniable. The way he held the weapon, the unconscious micro-adjustments to wind and angle, spoke of training that preceded modern military doctrine. "Target acquired," came the voice through their comm system. "Western balcony, military-aged male, positive identification confirmed. You are cleared hot for immediate elimination." The old man settled into a shooting position that looked deceptively casual, but achieved perfect stability through decades of practice. His breathing slowed to match the mountain's ancient rhythm, each exhale synchronized with wind patterns that changed with the precision of a conductor's baton. The rifle became an extension of his will rather than a separate tool. "In Soviet Army we learned mountain speaks before wind speaks," he murmured, his accent finally showing traces of Eastern European origin. "American training teaches technology. Russian training teaches patience. Afghan mountains teach both, but only to those who listen." Falcon felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The casual mention of Soviet military training, the intimate knowledge of these specific mountains, the supernatural awareness of wind patterns and target behavior. This wasn't just an experienced marksman. This was something far more dangerous and valuable. The target appeared on schedule, exactly as predicted, confirming intelligence that no official briefing had provided. A Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces, moving with the false confidence of someone who believed himself beyond American reach. The old man's finger caressed the trigger with surgical precision, applying pressure so gradually that the eventual shot would surprise even him. This was marksmanship elevated to art form, where mechanical function merged with environmental awareness to achieve something approaching perfection. Around them, the mountain held its breath. The shot exploded through the thin air with a crack that echoed off granite walls like thunder announcing judgment. The bullet traced a perfect arc through space and time, correcting for wind shear, elevation, and atmospheric pressure with mathematical precision that defied conventional ballistics training. 700 meters away, the Taliban commander's life ended before the sound of gunfire reached his ears. The impact was clean, professional, immediate. No suffering, no drama, simply the efficient elimination of a threat to American lives. Viper lowered her scope, her expression mixing professional admiration with profound confusion. She had witnessed thousands of combat engagements, had herself eliminated targets at extreme range, but nothing in her experience compared to what she had just observed. This shot represented mastery that transcended normal human capability. "Clean kill confirmed," reported Falcon into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "Target eliminated, mission accomplished." But his eyes never left the old man, who was already beginning to disassemble the rifle with practiced efficiency. Each movement spoke of muscle memory developed through decades of similar operations, hands that had held weapons through conflicts spanning multiple generations and ideologies. "How?" Viper asked, the question escaping before professional discipline could stop it. The old man's smile held memories of battles fought in places whose names were classified above most security clearances. When you have killed for 3 armies in these same mountains, you learn that bullets follow rules older than the weapons that fire them. Falcon's mind raced through possibilities, each more improbable than the last. Soviet forces had withdrawn from Afghanistan in 1989, meaning this man would have been active during a conflict that predated most modern military doctrine. The implications were staggering and politically dangerous. 3 armies, Falcon pressed. "Soviet Northern Alliance, now American," the old man replied, his tone carrying no judgment. "Mountains do not care about politics, they only care about precision." The radio crackled with extraction orders, but none of the SEALs moved. They were in the presence of something unprecedented, a living bridge between military eras that official history had kept carefully separated. The old man finished cleaning the rifle and handed it back to Falcon with ceremony befitting a sacred trust. "Your weapon will serve you better now," he said. "It has remembered what accuracy feels like." Before any of them could respond, he melted back into the landscape with the same supernatural stealth that had brought him to their position. Within seconds, it was as if he had never existed at all. The SEAL team was left alone with their successful mission, their professional confusion, and questions that would never appear in any official after-action report. They had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about training, experience, and the nature of military expertise itself. Falcon secured his rifle, nodding that it did indeed feel different in his hands, as if some essential quality had been transferred through contact with true mastery. The weight was the same, but the balance felt more natural, more responsive to his intentions. "Command, this is Falcon Team," he reported. "Target eliminated, mission complete, requesting immediate extraction." "Copy, Falcon, outstanding work, extraction in 30 minutes." But there was nothing outstanding about their work, and all three SEALs knew it. They had been outperformed by a stranger whose existence would never be acknowledged in military records, whose assistance would never earn official recognition, whose identity would remain classified under layers of operational security. As they prepared for extraction, each warrior privately grappled with the realization that their elite training represented only a fraction of what was possible when skill met understanding, when technology served wisdom rather than replacing it. The helicopter's rotor wash scattered dust across the ridgeline as the CH-47 Chinook descended toward their extraction point. The sound of twin rotors beating against thin mountain air provided familiar comfort after hours of mission tension, but today it also marked the end of an encounter that would reshape their understanding of warfare itself. Viper secured her gear with automatic precision while studying the terrain where the old man had disappeared. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no trace that anyone had ever been there. She had tracked insurgents across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, could read sign that most people would miss completely. But this disappearance challenged everything she understood about movement and concealment. "Did that really happen?" she asked Falcon, her voice barely audible over the approaching aircraft. Falcon checked his rifle one final time, noting subtle differences in the weapon's balance that confirmed their encounter had been real. "It happened," he replied, "but it never happened." The Chinook touched down in a whirlwind of dust and engine noise, its crew chief gesturing for immediate boarding. The SEAL team moved with practiced efficiency, but each carried the weight of questions that had no acceptable answers within official military doctrine. During the flight back to base, Falcon composed his after-action report in his head, carefully editing out any reference to external assistance. Their mission briefing had mentioned no friendly forces in the area, no local assets providing support, no possibility of encountering anyone with advanced military training. The official version would record a successful long-range elimination executed by SEAL team operators using standard techniques and equipment. The truth would remain buried under layers of classification and professional discretion, known only to three warriors who had learned humility from an impossible teacher. "Sir," Viper said over the helicopter's intercom system, "what do we tell debrief?" Falcon met her eyes, seeing his own conflict reflected there. They were sworn to honesty in their reporting, but they were also sworn to protect operational security and maintain mission integrity. Sometimes these obligations conflicted in ways that tested the moral foundations of military service. "We tell them we accomplished the mission," he replied. "We tell them the shot was clean and professional. We tell them American training and equipment proved superior to enemy capabilities." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't complete truth either. The space between those realities would define how they understood their place in a war far more complex than any official briefing had suggested. The Chinook banked toward their forward operating base, carrying 3 elite warriors who had learned that expertise existed in forms their training had never anticipated, in places their intelligence had never mapped, among people their classification systems could never properly categorize. Forward Operating Base Chapman appeared below them like a fortress of American engineering carved into hostile landscape. Concrete barriers, armored vehicles, sophisticated communication arrays, all the technological superiority that defined modern military power. Yet after their mountain encounter, these symbols of advancement seemed somehow inadequate, incomplete. The debrief took place in a windowless room where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across maps marked with targeting data and mission parameters. Major Harrison, their commanding officer, reviewed the after-action report with professional satisfaction, noting the successful elimination and clean extraction. "Outstanding work, Falcon team," he said. "Textbook precision shooting under challenging environmental conditions. This target had been evading elimination for 6 weeks." Falcon nodded, accepting praise that felt undeserved. Through the briefing room's reinforced door, he could hear the constant background noise of military operations, helicopter maintenance, radio chatter, the mechanical sounds of war machinery preparing for the next engagement. "Any complications or unusual circumstances?" Major Harrison asked, his pen hovering over the official documentation. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant firefight. Falcon glanced at Viper, then at their third team member, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Blade Thompson. All 3 faces reflected the same careful neutrality that special operations warriors learned to maintain when truth conflicted with mission requirements. "Negative, sir," Falcon replied. "Standard long-range elimination, no complications." The lie settled into official record with the weight of institutional necessity. Some truths were too dangerous for bureaucratic consumption, too complex for standard military documentation, too potentially destabilizing for operational security protocols. Major Harrison signed the report and filed it in a system that would eventually feed into statistical analyses of SEAL team effectiveness, tactical doctrine refinement, and budget justifications for advanced sniper programs. The old man's contribution would become invisible, absorbed into America's military mythology without acknowledgement or recognition. "Dismissed," the major said. "Outstanding work protecting American interests abroad." Outside the briefing room, the 3 SEALs walked toward their quarters in contemplative silence. The base buzzed with activity around them, soldiers heading to chow, mechanics working on armored vehicles, intelligence analysts reviewing satellite imagery. Life in a combat zone continued its relentless pace. "We going to talk about what happened up there?" Blade asked quietly. Falcon stopped walking, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm in a gesture that had become automatic after multiple deployments. But there was no enemy to fight, no clear tactical response to their situation. They were confronting questions that lay outside the boundaries of military training. The evening call to prayer echoed across the valley, a haunting reminder that they operated in someone else's homeland, among people whose relationship with these mountains stretched back millennia. Back in their quarters, the 3 warriors sat in silence, each processing the day's events through their own filters of experience and understanding. Their successful mission had accomplished its tactical objectives, but had opened philosophical questions that struck at the heart of their professional identity. Viper cleaned her equipment with meditative focus, her movements automatic after years of deployment routine. But her mind kept returning to the old man's eyes, which had held depths of experience that made her own combat history seem brief and shallow by comparison. 40 years, she said finally. He said he'd been watching these mountains for 40 years. Falcon nodded, understanding the implication. 40 years meant Soviet invasion, civil war, Taliban rule, Northern Alliance resistance, American occupation. This stranger had witnessed every phase of Afghanistan's modern military history, had somehow survived and adapted through multiple regime changes and foreign interventions. Makes you wonder who else is out there, Blade observed. People we never see, never acknowledge, but who understand this place better than any intelligence briefing. The thought was uncomfortable because it challenged core assumptions about American military superiority and technological advantage. Their training emphasized overwhelming firepower, advanced equipment, and superior tactics. The old man had demonstrated mastery that transcended all those advantages through simple understanding. Falcon opened his personal journal, a practice he had maintained through 4 deployments despite regulations, discouraging detailed documentation of special operations activities. Some experiences demanded recording, even if those records would never see official light. He began writing, trying to capture not just the facts but the feeling of witnessing expertise that belonged to a different era of warfare, when individual skill mattered more than technological systems, when understanding terrain meant survival rather than tactical advantage. The words came slowly, each sentence carefully constructed to preserve truth while protecting operational security. He wrote about wind patterns and elevation calculations, about the psychology of long-range shooting and environmental adaptation. But between the lines, he recorded his growing awareness that their elite status represented only one approach to military excellence. Outside their quarters, generators hummed with electrical power that kept their base functioning in hostile territory. Satellite communications linked them to command structures spanning the globe. Night vision equipment turned darkness into tactical advantage. Yet none of these technological marvels had solved their targeting problem. The old man's intervention had succeeded through applied wisdom that no training manual could adequately capture, knowledge that existed in the space between official doctrine and practical reality. He had read environmental conditions like ancient text, interpreting signs that escaped even sophisticated meteorological instruments. Viper reviewed satellite imagery on her tablet, studying the area where their mysterious instructor had vanished. The terrain showed no caves, no structures, no obvious concealment that would explain his disappearance. The man had simply become part of the landscape through techniques that predated modern camouflage technology. "We need to discuss this," she said finally, "not officially but among ourselves." Blade nodded agreement. Their encounter had implications that extended beyond tactical curiosity into questions about the nature of expertise itself, about the relationship between technology and skill, about their role as foreign warriors in someone else's ancient homeland. Falcon closed his journal and looked at his teammates, these 2 warriors who had trusted him through countless dangerous operations. They deserved honesty, even if official channels could never accommodate the complete truth of their experience. "What we saw today," he began carefully, "challenges assumptions we've been trained to accept without question." The conversation that followed would continue in whispered fragments over the remaining weeks of their deployment, growing into a shared understanding that would influence how they approached every subsequent mission. They had encountered something that existed outside official military frameworks, knowledge that belonged to places rather than institutions. Their success would be recorded in commendation letters and efficiency reports, but their education had just begun. The old man had given them more than tactical assistance. He had offered a glimpse into forms of expertise that their training had never acknowledged, skills that developed through intimate relationship with specific places and prolonged exposure to life-and-death decision-making. The night shift began around their base, bringing the familiar sounds of heightened security protocols and rotation duties. Sentries took positions along reinforced perimeters, while communications specialists monitored radio frequencies for signs of enemy activity. The machinery of military occupation continued its relentless function. But three elite warriors lay awake in their bunks, staring at ceiling tiles while processing experiences that would reshape their understanding of warfare, expertise, and their own limitations. They had received an education that no military institution could provide, taught by an instructor whose credentials existed only in the accumulated wisdom of survival. The Barrett rifle rested in Falcon's weapon rack, cleaned and secured according to regulations. But something essential had changed in its character, as if exposure to true mastery had awakened dormant potential within its mechanical systems. The weapon felt more responsive, more naturally balanced, more eager to translate intention into precision. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to test their evolving understanding against real-world tactical requirements. The old man's lessons would either prove valuable or dangerous, either enhancing their capabilities or undermining their confidence in established procedures. Viper fell asleep thinking about wind patterns and the way experience could substitute for technology, about the difference between textbook knowledge and intuitive understanding, about her own journey from promising recruit to seasoned operator. Her dreams were filled with mountain peaks and rifle scopes, with voices speaking in languages that transcended words. The base settled into its nighttime rhythm, protected by layers of security that represented decades of military technological development. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, satellite surveillance, electronic warfare systems, all designed to maintain American tactical advantage in hostile territory. Yet their most successful operation had been accomplished through guidance that belonged to an earlier era of warfare, when individual warriors developed intimate relationships with their environment rather than relying on technological intermediaries. The contradiction would influence tactical thinking in ways that no official doctrine could anticipate. Falcon's last conscious thought was a question that would pursue him through months of subsequent operations. How many other invisible teachers existed in the shadows of America's foreign wars, possessing knowledge that could transform military effectiveness but remaining forever outside official recognition? Dawn brought the familiar sounds of base reveille and equipment preparation, but also helicopter rotors announcing an unexpected arrival. A Black Hawk descended through morning mist, carrying passengers whose presence suggested developments beyond routine operational tempo. Colonel Patricia, Iron Lady, Kozlov emerged from the aircraft with the purposeful stride of an officer whose career had been built on solving problems that lesser commanders found intractable. Her reputation preceded her through every special operations community. A former Air Force pilot who had transitioned to Joint Special Operations Coordination after surviving 3 aircraft shootdowns and leading successful rescue operations. She walked directly toward Falcon Team's quarters, her bearing suggesting this visit was connected to their recent mission success. Behind her came a figure that made all 3 SEALs freeze in recognition and disbelief. The old man from the mountain followed Colonel Kozlov across the base with the same unhurried confidence he had displayed during their first encounter. But now, he wore clean fatigues bearing no rank insignia, his appearance suggesting official sanction for his presence. "Falcon Team, report to Briefing Room 7 immediately," came the announcement over the base public address system. Within minutes, the 3 SEALs found themselves seated across a conference table from their mysterious instructor, who now occupied a chair beside Colonel Kozlov with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to high-level military consultations. "Gentlemen and lady," Colonel Kozlov began, "meet Viktor Petrov, formerly Colonel Viktor Petrov of Soviet Spetsnaz Mountain Reconnaissance, currently contractor providing specialized training to selected American units." The revelation landed like a flashbang in an enclosed space. Viktor Petrov was a legend within special operations communities, a ghost story told in briefing rooms where officers discussed legendary snipers and impossible shots. His existence had been classified at levels that made discussion dangerous for career advancement. Your mission yesterday served dual purposes, Colonel Kozlov continued. Elimination of a high-value target, yes, but also evaluation of whether American Special Operations personnel could benefit from alternative training methodologies. Viper felt pieces of a larger puzzle assembling into coherent structure. Their isolation, their repeated failures, the old man's convenient appearance, none of it had been coincidental. They had been participating in an experiment whose parameters extended far beyond their original mission briefing. "With respect, ma'am," Falcon said carefully, "our operational security was compromised. Unknown individuals approached our position without authorization." Colonel Kozlov's expression suggested she had anticipated this concern. Mr. Petrov operates under presidential classification levels that supersede your need-to-know authorization. His presence was cleared through channels above your command structure. The implications were politically sensitive and operationally significant. American Special Operations Forces were receiving training from former Soviet military personnel, knowledge transfer that represented strategic cooperation at the highest classification levels. Petrov spoke for the first time since entering the briefing room, his voice carrying the same quiet authority they had witnessed on the mountain. "American military training is excellent for technological warfare, but incomplete for environmental integration. These mountains have lessons that no classroom can teach." His words carried the weight of professional assessment rather than criticism. He was offering analysis based on decades of comparative experience across multiple military systems and conflict environments. "Your shooting was technically proficient but environmentally ignorant," he continued, addressing the team directly. "You calculated for standard ballistic factors, but ignored microclimatic variables that these elevations create." Falcon found himself leaning forward despite his professional skepticism. This was critique from someone whose credentials existed beyond doubt, analysis that could enhance their tactical effectiveness in ways that formal training had missed. "The shot you missed," Petrov said, pulling out detailed topographical maps marked with meteorological annotations, "failed because you used sea-level ballistic calculations at 8,000 feet elevation during thermal inversion conditions created by morning sun angles." The explanation was simultaneously technical and poetic, grounding environmental physics in practical shooting applications. Their failure had resulted from incomplete understanding rather than inadequate skill or defective equipment. Colonel Kozlov spread additional documents across the briefing table: training proposals, budget authorizations, security clearances that would allow expanded cooperation between American forces and carefully selected foreign specialists. "This program is designated Operation Mountain Wisdom," she explained. "Selected special operations teams will receive enhanced environmental training from instructors whose experience spans multiple conflict eras and geographical regions." Viper studied the paperwork, recognizing classification markings that indicated presidential oversight and congressional authorization. This was not some experimental side project, but a formal program backed by the highest levels of military leadership. "The enemy understands this terrain in ways that our technological superiority cannot always overcome," Colonel Kozlov continued. "We need warriors who can bridge that gap through enhanced environmental integration." The phrase "enhanced environmental integration" was military bureaucracy's attempt to categorize something that transcended standard training classifications. They were discussing the development of intuitive tactical awareness through prolonged exposure to specific environments under expert guidance. Petrov unfolded a larger map showing training locations across Afghanistan's mountain regions, each marked with specific environmental challenges that would test different aspects of advanced marksmanship under extreme conditions. "Your team has been selected for initial training cycle," he announced. 6 weeks, full immersion, mountain warfare techniques that combine American technology with Soviet environmental doctrine. The offer was simultaneously opportunity and challenge, chance for professional development that would enhance their tactical effectiveness, while exposing them to training methodologies that existed outside normal military experience. Falcon looked at his teammates, reading confirmation in their expressions. They had dedicated their lives to achieving military excellence, to pushing the boundaries of what special operations forces could accomplish. This program offered access to expertise that could enhance their capabilities in ways that conventional training never could. "We accept," he said simply. Colonel Kozlov smiled with satisfaction that suggested this outcome had been anticipated. "Training begins tomorrow at 0500. You'll be operating under deep cover protocols with full classification authority." The briefing concluded with distribution of specialized equipment and documentation that would support their extended training cycle. Enhanced cold weather gear, modified weapon systems, communication equipment designed for extended operations in remote terrain. But more important than equipment was the psychological preparation required for learning from someone whose background challenged comfortable assumptions about allies and enemies, about the relationship between American military superiority and indigenous tactical knowledge. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Petrov addressed them one final time. "Forget everything you think you know about mountain warfare," he said. "Learning begins with admitting ignorance." The training would test more than their marksmanship skills. It would challenge their fundamental understanding of what military expertise could become when it merged American technological advantages with wisdom developed through decades of intimate environmental relationship. Their real education was just beginning. Training began before dawn on a mountainside that seemed designed specifically to humble overconfident warriors. Petrov led them up slopes that tested cardiovascular conditioning developed through years of elite physical training, but which demanded adaptation to altitude and terrain that no gymnasium could replicate. "American training teaches you to fight mountains," he said, his breathing steady despite the thin air. "Soviet training taught us to become part of them." The philosophical difference translated into practical applications that would reshape their tactical thinking. Instead of imposing technological solutions on environmental challenges, they would learn to work within natural systems, leveraging terrain features and atmospheric conditions rather than fighting against them. Their first lesson involved spending 6 hours in complete silence, simply observing wind patterns and light changes across the valley below. No equipment, no instruments, just human senses learning to interpret environmental data that sophisticated meteorological systems often missed. Viper found the exercise frustrating initially, her action-oriented personality rebelling against passive observation. But gradually, she began noticing subtleties that had escaped her attention during previous operations, how shadows moved across distant ridgelines, how temperature changes affected air density, how wildlife behavior indicated human presence. "You are learning to read the mountain's mood," Petrov explained during their first break. "In Soviet Army, we called it terrain psychology. Every landscape has personality that affects tactical decisions." The concept was simultaneously mystical and practical, treating environmental factors as dynamic variables rather than static obstacles to overcome. This approach required patience and observation skills that conventional military training often neglected in favor of technological solutions. By midday, they were practicing shooting positions that incorporated natural terrain features for stability and concealment. Petrov demonstrated techniques developed during the Soviet-Afghan War, when superior enemy knowledge of local terrain had forced adaptation or death. Taliban fighters grew up in these mountains, he said, adjusting Falcon's position against a boulder formation. They understand wind patterns, elevation effects, seasonal variations that foreign soldiers must learn through painful experience. The training was physically demanding but intellectually transformative, requiring them to abandon preconceptions about proper technique in favor of approaches that worked within specific environmental conditions. Their expertise was being deconstructed and rebuilt according to principles that predated modern military doctrine. Blade struggled initially with shooting positions that felt awkward compared to his standard training, but gradually recognized how these techniques achieved superior stability and concealment through cooperation with natural features, rather than opposition to them. Your previous training was designed for controlled environments, Petrov observed. Range shooting, urban warfare, maritime operations, but mountains operate according to rules that existed before humans invented weapons. The distinction was crucial because it addressed limitations that even elite warriors rarely acknowledged. Their training had been excellent for situations that resembled controlled conditions, but incomplete for environments that demanded adaptation and improvisation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the training area, Petrov introduced them to wind reading techniques that relied on visual observation rather than technological measurement. Learning to see air movement through its effects on dust, vegetation, and thermal layers. Soviet snipers developed these methods because our equipment was less sophisticated than Western technology, he explained. We learned to see what instruments could measure, to feel what sensors could detect. The techniques required sensory development that went beyond normal military training into areas that resembled meditation or martial arts, more than conventional marksmanship instruction. They were learning to use their bodies as precision instruments calibrated for specific environmental conditions. Their shooting accuracy improved dramatically as they incorporated these observational skills into their targeting process. Shots that would have missed using standard calculations found their marks when guided by enhanced environmental awareness. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, representing a fusion of American technological training with Soviet environmental doctrine that created capabilities neither system could achieve independently. They were becoming hybrid warriors, equally comfortable with advanced equipment and primitive observation techniques. By evening, exhaustion had settled into their muscles like familiar weight from countless training exercises. But this fatigue felt different, more complete, as if they had been engaging mental and physical systems that standard military conditioning rarely accessed. Around their small campfire, Petrov shared stories from his decades of mountain warfare experience, tales that illuminated the human dimension of conflict in ways that official military histories rarely captured. These were not heroic narratives, but practical accounts of survival, adaptation, and learning from mistakes that could have proven fatal. In 1987, my spotter was killed by American-supplied Stinger missile, he said matter-of-factly. 3 days later, I eliminated the Mujahideen team responsible, not from hatred, but from tactical necessity. War makes enemies of people who might otherwise share knowledge. His words hung in the thin air like smoke from their fire, highlighting the circular nature of conflict in regions where foreign powers pursued contradictory objectives across multiple decades. They were receiving training from someone who had once been their enemy, who had fought against American interests using skills he was now sharing with American forces. The moral complexity was uncomfortable but undeniable. Military effectiveness, sometimes required cooperation that transcended political boundaries, learning from opponents whose expertise could enhance tactical capabilities regardless of historical animosity. Tomorrow, Petrov announced, you learn to shoot at night without thermal optics. The challenge seemed impossible until they realized he meant using enhanced sensory awareness rather than abandoning technology completely. They would learn to integrate sophisticated equipment with primitive observation skills, creating hybrid capabilities that maximized both technological advantages and environmental adaptation. Sleep came easily despite their philosophical confusion, physical exhaustion, overwhelming mental complexity. But their dreams were filled with mountain peaks and rifle scopes, with voices speaking in accents that carried the weight of accumulated warfare experience. They were 3 weeks into training when everything changed again. The insertion helicopter had been delayed by weather, stranding them on a remote peak where Petrov had planned to demonstrate extreme-range shooting techniques. What should have been a 6-hour exercise became a 3-day survival situation when communication equipment failed during an unexpected storm system. Equipment breaks, Petrov observed with characteristic calm. Mountains do not care about your logistics. They found shelter in a cave system that showed evidence of previous occupation, Soviet ammunition caches, Mujahedin fighting positions, Northern Alliance supply depots. Layers of military history preserved in stone chambers where different armies had sought protection from the same environmental forces. Viper explored the deepest sections of the cave, while Falcon and Blade worked on repairing their communication equipment. In the furthest chamber, she discovered something that stopped her completely. Carved names and dates covering nearly every surface, a memorial wall chronicling decades of military presence. Alexei Volkov, 1987, mountain took his body, wind took his soul. Ahmed Hassan, 1995, fought for freedom, died for truth. Marcus Williams, 2003, American warrior, died far from home. The inscriptions continued in multiple languages, recording the passage of soldiers whose names would never appear in official casualty reports. She called the others to witness this informal monument to warriors who had found common ground in shared respect for the mountains that had claimed their lives. Enemy and ally united in death, their final messages carved by comrades who understood that some bonds transcended political divisions. Petrov stood before the memorial wall with the reverence of someone reading the names of old friends. Every army leaves ghosts in these peaks, he said quietly. Soviet, Mujahedin, Taliban, American. Mountains remember them all equally. His words carried weight that official military doctrine rarely acknowledged, that warfare created shared experiences among opponents, that enemy soldiers often possessed courage and skill worthy of professional respect, that death in combat earned recognition regardless of which flag the fallen had served. Blade traced one inscription with his finger. James Morrison, SEAL Team 6, 2010, died protecting his brothers. The name was familiar from briefings about special operations casualties, but seeing it carved in stone by grieving teammates created emotional connection that casualty statistics could never convey. We add to the wall, Petrov announced, not for dead but for understanding. Using his combat knife, he began carving. Falcon, Viper, Blade, American warriors learned Soviet wisdom, October 2025. The inscription joined hundreds of others in this underground museum of military experience, connecting their training to a tradition that transcended national boundaries. The storm passed on the third day, but their extraction was delayed by operational security requirements that kept their location classified above routine helicopter support levels. They spent additional time practicing advanced techniques while living on emergency rations and melted snow. During those extra days, their training evolved from structured instruction into organic learning, with Petrov sharing knowledge that existed only through lived experience rather than formal military education. Stories about reading weather patterns through animal behavior, about finding water sources using vegetation indicators, about moving through hostile territory using techniques that predated electronic surveillance. Soviet mountain training was designed for nuclear war scenarios, he explained while demonstrating camouflage techniques using natural materials. No resupply, no communication, no support except what individual soldiers could create through environmental adaptation. The training was preparing them for independence that went beyond normal special operations self-sufficiency into realms where warriors became completely integrated with their operational environment. They were learning to become ghosts in landscapes that could hide or